Today I have with me Jan Kirchner, who is a neuroscience PhD at the Max Planck Institute for Brain Research in the Computation in Neural Circuit group. And for context, so the two of us met basically a year ago at EA Global Reconnect, which because of COVID was an online effective altruism conference. And we got in touch because of our interest in cognitive science and neuroscience. And yeah, that's where we got to know. And then last weekend, we met at EA Global again and had some very nice discussions. And I figured out one of the best things I could do right now is just basically introduce more people to what you do because it's very interesting. And then also I was sitting next to you at a table while you were explaining your research in depth to someone else while my brain was already completely fried. So I'm really looking forward to finally learn about your research in more detail. So thank you, Jan, for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I thought let's start directly with a kind of controversial and therefore very interesting topic, which is you're currently having some thoughts of what drug addicts and artificial intelligence have in common and the implications for AI safety. So what is this about?
Yes, so this is a project that I've been working on together with a friend for a couple of months, and she is a clinical psychiatrist who's also very interested in effective altruism and in writing. So we thought what might be a good topic that we can collaborate on. And she had this idea or this observation that drug addicts tend to be very, very single-minded and kind of efficient in getting more drugs. Like it sounds a little bit funny, but this like they can be modeled as this kind of very efficient optimizer for a singular goal. And this made some bells ring for both of us, where we thought that this might be an interesting model to think about when we're thinking about AIs. Because the field of AI safety has been thinking about potential dangers posed by AI. And many of the arguments that are made there are either based on pure thought experiments or on computer models abstracted. But there are really no great real life examples of what an AI might look like. So it is very valuable to have something that's out there in real life and where we can potentially observe some of the things we might expect from an advanced AI. So that got us started on this track. And then we went down into the literature, drew some parallels between what drug addicts do and what we know, what we anticipate AIs may do. And we found some interesting parallels. I think this was published today or yesterday evening. So that's probably where you saw it.
Very nice. So what I think like many people who are listening right now might not actually know why is a drug addict in a very oversimplified manner, of course, like singling in on one idea or one goal so much, like what's happening there. And yeah, what could be an analogy for AI systems?
I see. Yes. So my collaborator, Nadia, she starts with this interesting anecdote of a drug addict that lies and deceives basically this family to get more drugs. And this is kind of common behavior for drug addicts. Maybe let's dive into the neurobiology first. So yes. The drugs commonly trigger the reward circuit of the brain, but much stronger, like a super stimulus, much stronger than usual stimuli could do. And they start to reshape the brain and carve out grooves in the brain that start overwriting lots of other behavior. So this makes the brain single-minded is the term that we use. So it really stops caring about other things. The drug addict starts trading money, possessions, and former social connections in for more drugs. And really all those other values that used to be very important decrease strongly in importance, and the drug becomes much more important than everything else. And in that sense, in having like a single thing that is very important, it resembles some proposals for how an AI might work at the moment where you always have an objective function, so some kind of numerical value that is assigned to certain outcomes, and the AI or the machine learning system then tries to maximize for making that one number go as high as possible. And this is kind of the parallel between the two, and where we might expect that some of the behavior might be similar.
So the analogy is, for, I think, how is the book called? The alignment problem. And I think it starts with this example of he looks at a boat and the boat is on fire and it's going in circles, where a reinforcement learning system just like learns that there's this stupid behavior it can do to just maximize reward, even though it has nothing to do with the things it would actually care about. So that's kind of what you're referring to, I guess.
Exactly. That's an example of Goodhart's law. So Goodhart's law says that whenever a metric becomes a target, it ceases to be a good metric. So the AI system, the reinforcement learner, has learned that it gets a lot of points when it goes over a certain point. And since it only cares about the points and not actually reaching the goal, it just goes over the point again and again. Yeah.
So is the main insight there the analogy that these things have something in common, or can we learn something from it? Like what do we need more? Like I don't know. Just you tell me.
Yeah. No, so I mean, a priori, it might not be a bad thing to have something that optimizes just for a single value very strongly, but there have been arguments, like Nick Bostrom put forward this argument of instrumental convergence, where he says that a wide range of final values that we're trying to achieve might all have in common that you adopt sub-goals, or you assign value to certain sub-goals that lead you better to your final goal. And some of those sub-goals are, for example, technological perfection. You might try to improve the technology that you're using so that you're more efficient at getting the goal that you have. Resource collection, basically trying to get more and more resources, is also one of the things that were proposed by Bostrom. And those are features that we see in the drug addict as well. Many of them started working many odd jobs or stealing to accumulate more money to get more drugs. Most of them transition from snorting the drug to intravenously injecting it to get a stronger high out of the same amount of drug that we might call technological perfection if we want. So yeah, on the one hand, the addict serves as a real life example of this instrumental convergence, which is bad, right? We don't want a single actor to accumulate all the resources that is necessarily going to have detrimental effects on other people whose resources get taken. And the other big thought experiment that has been floating around on AIs is this of the deceptive alignment, or like just deception in general, where we might expect that even though we don't program the AI to be deceptive or to lie to us, that it might just end up in a situation where that is the preferred option to take to pursue its own goals as efficiently as possible. And for that, again, the drug addict is a nice example, because they need cooperation from people around them, from the family. They need to be let into the house. So they have to pretend, or they have to deceive that they are actually sharing the values of the family now. They don't like drugs anymore. They want to like have a nice family life. And they only pretend up until the point where they've achieved the instrumental goal of getting the resources. And then, yeah, they switch back to the real final values.
Yeah, that really reminds me of the elephant in the brain and the topic about, so if you want to deceive others successfully and they are like socially savvy and they can read your body language, then the best way to deceive others is basically to start believing the message yourself. So this, of course, would also really massively, infer with your own epistemics and beliefs in the end.
Interesting. Yes, that's true.
So are you proposing that we should have therapy for AI systems, or?
So that is, I mean, now that we've established a link between those two domains, it is of course tempting to think about what can one domain learn from the other and the other way around. And Nadia, as a psychiatrist, has performed addiction therapy on addicts and knows a little bit what works and what doesn't work. And it's kind of a droll idea to think about AIs sitting in a circle and then talking about their problems with each other. And of course, that's a cartoon version of how like something like this might actually work. But there are some things that might at least be worth exploring. So instead of calling it group therapy for AIs, you might think about an ensemble of AIs that are all semi-aligned with human values, monitoring each other for like anomalies. Like whenever one of them starts to really be disaligned, all the others that are still semi-aligned might try to convince this one or modify this one AI to be aligned again. So this is at least a proposal that I haven't encountered before in the AI safety space. So potentially it's something new that we got from transferring it over from the psychiatry perspective. Although I'm not super confident that this would actually work or this is actually super useful, I think more the method of transferring knowledge from one field into the other field is potentially very useful if applied broadly.
Yeah, that's also what I really like about cognitive science in general, that you try to make sense of one field and what the insights mean for another. So that's, I like often just analyses and analogies and tools for insight are extremely important to just like understand it better and also to communicate it to others.
Yes.
So I'm as you are very interested in effective altruism, but I'm really not specialized in AI research, and I've kind of intentionally thought less about the topic to be able to dive deeper into other topics. So what is like your meta view on the whole question of AI safety and the importance?
Yeah, so there is a difficult self-reference problem here. What I mean is that I'm really excited about AI in general. This is what got me into academia in the first place. I wanted to learn more about this stuff, and now it feels very tempting that effective altruism has also converged on AI as one of the important topics. And I feel like, yeah, that's totally right. But of course, I have all the incentives to believe that. And as a good rationalist, I want to be aware of that. But that being said, like the strongest case I can make for AI safety being important is probably very along the lines of what Toby Ord has made. So Toby Ord, a philosopher who recently released a book, The Precipice, where he evaluates different extinction threats for humanity. And he's going about this in a very analytic, clear-headed way and doesn't assign like crazy probabilities to anything. Even like things that are very much on the forefront of our mind, like volcano eruptions or like catastrophic climate change events or something, end up getting a smaller probability of being very devastating for humanity than AI safety. And I think the other big one is engineered viruses, who are also like super dangerous to humanity's continued existence. So he's not necessarily someone who has a horse in the race when it comes to like liking AI. I feel he's clear-headed enough about this that if he didn't actually think that AI was important, then he wouldn't have assigned the high probability that he has assigned. So that reaffirms me a little bit in me also believing that AI might be important. Yeah.
I think I had a similar experience where many of the very intelligent people in the effective altruism community that I knew thought that AI was very important. And then I think in Bayesian epistemology, you would also say, in this case, you should already update yourself, especially if you have before always updated in the direction when you read argumentations. But I feel like this is by now the main point why I believe in it, because I see other very smart people believing in it, but not necessarily because I buy all the arguments for any, for example, strong takeoff ideas. But I do really like Toby's research, and what I found especially striking was that basically he published a book, which means he already worked on it a couple of years earlier. And one of the examples was, of course, a potential pandemic, and then it happened at the same time, basically, that the book was published, and we actually have seen that. Which, especially when, like before, when you engage with those ideas, you were sometimes feeling like you're in a bubble and this might not be in touch with reality at all. And then it actually happening was very grounding in a very sad way.
I agree. Yeah, a very sad prophet who like predicts something and then immediately, or who predicts something sad and then it immediately comes to pass. That is, yeah.
Yeah, and then from my own research on like unmeasurable uncertainty, I don't necessarily think you can put numbers on the actual probabilities or like kind of an objective probability out there. It always reflects your own beliefs about it. But of course, you need scenario planning, right? It doesn't matter how likely it will actually happen. If there's a reasonable or plausible probability or plausible reason to think it can happen, then we should put some resources towards preparation. And I really like also Toby's term of the attention portfolio of humanity. I think that's also a very good analogy to just think about, are we properly distributing our resources, also like cognitive ones, over important problems. And even if it doesn't happen, some people should think about AI safety.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely, I agree. The recent State of AI report says that there are only 40 AI safety researchers like on the entire planet working in high-end labs. I guess they haven't counted the people writing on the AI alignment forum, but still 40 is basically nothing, right? So any marginal increase of that number might potentially, just by multiplying out the numbers, have a huge effect on, positive impact on the world.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And all my interaction with people working on the topic in big organizations usually say that what they're actually doing is writing reports, but not actually doing anything apart from that. Okay, but let's jump to a different topic. So do you want to first go more into the EA direction or more into the research direction?
Since we've been already talking about AI so much, we can dive into language models if you.
Perfect. That's the one that I heard you talking on next to you, but I was already completely unable to listen. My throat has also been sore just from talking for 12 hours a day, like multiple days in a row. That was very intense during the conference. But I hope you're not tired yet talking about the topic. So what is that about?
Yes, so like I mentioned in the beginning, this is like AI was one of the big reasons why I went into academia in the first place. And I've always had little side projects that I've been working on. And one side project that I did in the last holiday, like half a year ago, was taking a big language model. So language models are this cool new trend in AI where it's all about modeling the structure of language and getting statistical models to predict text, basically, and generate text. And there was this big GPT-3 model that came out last year that made a big splash, but the weights for that model have not been openly accessible. And then half a year ago, this online club of programmers and hobbyists called Aluther AI, they released the GPT-J model, which is a small version of GPT-3 with all the weights available, basically. And I thought, that's really cool. I want to play with that. I want to use that. And to do that, first of all, you need like a lot of computational resources. And luckily, there is a program by Google where like researchers and hobbyists can get a lot of resources, computational resources from Google to do these kinds of experiments. So I signed up for that. And then what I did is I took this GPT-J model and fine-tuned it. So I continued training on all the text that I've basically written in the last 10, 12 years in my note-taking app and like chat messages and everything. So thereby this language model got fine-tuned on my style of writing, of speaking, got familiarized with a lot of the concepts that I'm thinking about recently. And after having this fine-tuned language model, I started embedding it into all kinds of workflows of mine, where now in my note-taking app, I can query the fine-tuned language model to predict what kind of text I would write given the context of the note. And in chat apps, I also have it available. So this is a small AI assistant that I've built.
How does it feel when it predict? How well does it predict you, and how does it feel like? Is it like, oh my God, I would literally write exactly that? How can this thing predict me so well? Or like, how does it feel?
Yeah, it's really cool. It definitely knows a lot of the things that I do. So it very frequently talks about EA and like about Darmstadt and Frankfurt and like the area where I live. And so that's pretty cool. It's not like, it's to some extent logically coherent, that it can string like 2 or 3 sentences together that make a coherent argument, but then eventually it kind of goes blah, 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 blah. So it's not quite perfect for getting like full-fledged ideas, but it is really great at writing poetry and like, I don't know, just short messages to all kinds of people. Had a lot of fun experimenting with that stuff.
And how much better do you think that is from, I think, right, like Google in Gmail has also rolled out some of those predictions by now. And I assume they also learn like it's personalized, but they have some basis or something like from which they like start to change it more to a personalized way. But like how much better do you think this is to the normal product?
Yeah, so I haven't used the Google automatic email response a lot. I guess this one is very domain specific for emails, and it has learned like the format of emails, while this fine-tuned GPTJ model is very, very general and can do emails and notes and chat messages, and has learned all of that. So I don't know exactly how it compares. Have you
created something where you can chat with yourself now?
I have tried that, yes.
How did this go?
It's weirdly, so maybe this, this is also interesting. So when I query it about friends or family, I always get like super, super positive generated things, because usually if I take notes or if I write messages, it's always in a happy context or something. While for myself, the picture is much more nuanced, right? It's not purely positive, it's not purely negative, it's also sort of very like thoughtful sometimes, which is insanely solipsistic, right? I mean, or reveals how self-centered we all are, I mean, me included. So yeah, talking to myself in that app is really weird. Simulating other humans is much more fun or interesting.
So you've also tried that with other people?
I mean, through the pre-training, GPTJ already knows everybody that's on the internet. So like Stephen Hawking or Richard Feynman, you could have conversations, yeah.
Oh, okay, I didn't know that. That sounds like a lot of fun. So any big learning you took away from that, or was it more just like getting an intuition of what it can do and cannot do?
Yeah, so it was a cool learning experience for sure. It also showed like certain limitations, but what is the most exciting for me is this idea that as language models get bigger, as these technologies get better, it might really be feasible to have a small research assistant that helps you with a lot of the tasks. And this connects to one thing that I've been thinking about for a long time, and that has to do with productivity. And a lot of people on Twitter or whatever are very obsessed with productivity and try to always get like the best hacks and the best tools to like squeeze out a little bit more productivity. And I always thought that's a little bit silly, right? The overhead doesn't quite justify like what you get out in the end. But these AI research assistants, I think, are qualitatively different in the sense that they don't only let you squeeze out more of your own productivity, they actually help you scale your own productivity. You could outsource some of the work that you would have to do to a different entity and then have that entity do the work instead of just having yourself do it faster. So I find that really exciting and potentially very impactful for how research is done in the next 10, 20 years or so.
Nice. Like, could you give an example of how that could look like?
Yes. So I'm currently supervising master students as part of the PhD, and I'm giving them jobs and I say like, okay, until next week, run this set of simulations, until next week, do this or that. But sometimes the job that I give them is just read these 5 papers and give me a summary of what you've learned. And that's a job that like the fine-tuned GPTJ could already do now, right? I would feed all the text into it and ask to summarize it. And an unfine-tuned model might just give me a high-level summary of all the stuff that's written there, which would already be useful. But through the fine-tuning process, I would also get like highlights of the stuff from the papers that's relevant to my research in particular. So that's exactly what the master student would be doing. And that's also what a GPTJ fine-tuned model could be doing.
Well, in this case, the goal is, of course, not just getting the summary, but also the master student learning something in the process, right?
Yes, absolutely.
But that makes a lot of sense. I think I've recently found an app or something where you can upload papers and it tries to summarize it, but I was not blown away by the results, but it was also not bad.
Yeah, it's getting there. OpenAI has this really cool new paper that came out a couple of months ago where they're summarizing books, or they're doing like recursive summaries of books, and it's like Alice in Wonderland or something. So not a scientific paper yet, but it's amazingly good how like it moves up from paragraphs to chapters to the entire book and just always condenses the summary even further.
I have to look into that, especially with Alice. I assume it's pretty hard because the writing style is so much of the information, right? There's absurdity in there. Okay. Is there anything you want to add on to the topic of language models and what you did here?
Not necessarily. There's one. Yeah.
Oh, please go ahead.
So there's one thing that you mentioned where you said it's also about the learning experience of the master student. And, yes. I of course agree, like that is part of the job. But I think this is, we are conflating certain things where academia has become this really big package of just all the things, right? We're supposed to teach and do research and also be like superhumans that do outreach and whatever. And I think one step to doing really, really great research is to start to disentangle this. And like when you want to teach, you're teaching. When you want to do research, you're doing research, but not necessarily conflating those two things at the same time. If that makes sense.
That's a good point. My master's thesis supervisor always recommends the I think, is it a paper or an essay? If you really like research, you should not go into academia. Or if you really like science, you should not go into, I don't know. So he just makes the point, like in there was an analysis of how many like hours in relation to the total job are actually research. And it seems like that drops, especially after PhD, very quickly to mostly being management. So you think you're going into research, but in the end, you just go into managing PhD students. So yeah, untangling that seems like a very good point, and just making it clear that you also have sub-specialization. I sometimes make the point that, so I sometimes get asked why I do science outreach, even though I don't have, I'm not world-class expert in anything. And I think it's always, it's first of all about relative expertise. And then I also make the point that often the world best experts, they are no longer good in communicating anything, because first of all, it gets very sub-verbal once it becomes very intuitive, when you have to actually hold so much in your mind. And then they're really good at the research. It doesn't mean they're especially good at teaching. So I really love the point that, understanding this, that it's different skills, makes a lot of sense.
I agree.
Well, you gave me the perfect bridge now to the next topic, which is, we talked about your thoughts about on scaling academia. So let me hear. Or please repeat what your thoughts there are.
Yes, that is indeed the perfect bridge into this topic. So it started for me with just an observation that I found interesting, where research groups, or all the research groups that I know, tend to be limited at around 10 people or like maybe 15 people. And sometimes you get a big group of 30 people, sometimes you get an insane group of 100 people, but that's usually then again like subdivided into actually it's multiple groups. So there seems to be almost a natural upper bound on how large individual research groups can grow. And in contrast to that, if you look at industry, like companies, they're much less bounded. So Walmart has almost 1 million employees, and other companies quickly grow beyond this limit of just 10 people. And starting from that observation, I kind of tried to come up with reasons why might it be limited at 10 people only. And one strong point is that doubt is like one big inherent component of scientific thinking. You always want to question your assumptions. You always want to question, like, is this actually the direction I should be moving in? But doubt doesn't really scale. once you try to have too many layers in your hierarchy, or you try to grow your group too big, the doubt just becomes overwhelming, especially at the fringes of the group. And then you can't have a central message anymore that survives so many levels of doubt. But other components that also limit the scalability of academia appear to be a lack of systematization. So in academia, it's this big thing that every group has their own system, and it's all mainly focused on doing, like, I don't know, being flat hierarchies and having certain freedoms about how you do your work, which certainly makes a lot of sense, but also is a big difference to how it's done potentially in industry, and also different to how it was done at the Manhattan Project, where we had a very large number of people all working on the same project in a rigid hierarchy and like clear chain of command, or similarly like large scientific programs like the Human Genome Project. So this potential lack of high level organization is a difference. And then also just a lack of this scale mindset, I guess. Like I haven't even encountered researchers who are thinking about having research groups of 1,000 people, so I'm not sure how much that plays into it.
How was the brain project called that failed so successfully recently? I think that didn't work out.
The Human Brain Project, yes. Exactly.
Oh yeah, exactly. So it's the analogy to the Human Genome Project. Do you have an idea why some succeed and why some don't?
Yes, that's a great question. That is then the next question. I think one factor that led to like the failure of the Human Brain Project is that the central vision from the beginning just wasn't really clear or feasible. And this is the distinguishing factor to like the Human Genome Project or the Manhattan Project, where from the beginning it was very clear and the strategy was kind of outlined how to go from A to B. And this might be the necessary component to scale something up like that. You absolutely need a clear idea of how to actually go from A to B and what B is and how you decompose your problem into sub-problems so you can divide it up. But
so once you know how to solve it, then it's basically solved, no?
You would think that. Kind of. So there is this example of Terence Tao with the polymath project, where there was this mathematical conjecture that has been unproven for a long while. And then Terence Tao had the idea or the hunch that a certain proof strategy should work on this mathematical theorem. And just having this hunch or just having the strong conviction is not actually sufficient. You also need the actual proof to be sure that it works. But having this hunch was for him the starting point of something that's called the Polymath Project, where he now outsourced the proof of this theorem to his community. So hundreds of commenters collaborated together to build the proof together of this strong theorem using the strategy outlined by Terence Tao. And I think this is really the blueprint of how large-scale scientific projects can work. You need one person who has a hunch or a very clear intuition for the proof strategy that should work.
So basically how would Tomasello call it? Is it collective intentionality, or what sets humans apart from other species?
That is certainly related. Yeah, and it also has something to do with the doubt again, right? If you have a collective intentionality, that means you don't excessively doubt the direction that everybody's moving, and you're kind of clear on the vision that you want to reach.
Yeah, so it's not just, you basically have a strategy, right? The strategy is that you have an idea of how you also, it's not just the goal, but you subscribe also to a certain way you all try to go. Mm-hmm. So you exactly give up on questioning the one path suggested in this case. Is that like your main argument here?
Yes, that is, yeah, I mean, that's an observation at this point that apparently this is necessary. Yeah,
it's still in a speculation phase, but I think it's very important to think about those questions. I think there's also many arguments that the innovation or like new insights in academia have actually stagnated over the last years, especially in relation to how many more researchers we have now in total. And then there's of course this question like what changed, or like is it just are the ideas just like all thought of by now, or does it have something to do with the institutions we're having?
Yeah. I mean, lots of people have lots of opinions about this. My take is that it might just have to do with the overwhelming amount of new science that has been generated or is being generated every day, where thousands of papers are being published and just nobody has the capacity to even read the abstracts of all of that. Like it is just impossible to stay on top of the literature and identify convergent streams of research out of the sea of everything that's happening. And therefore, it's also very hard to have a consistent vision or a consistent strategy of where to go, right? The territory has just become super foggy and people can't come up with a vision that unites people enough to push consistently in one direction.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think you mentioned at EA Global, you mentioned a couple of other projects that try to do things like that. Do some come to mind you could mention now? Yes,
absolutely. So the folks at Aud are amazing, and a lot of my thinking has been influenced by what they are doing. They're building this product, Illicit.
Yeah, can you give an overview of what they're doing?
Yeah, so they are trying to scale the output of academics, or building tools that allow academics to scale their output. And their main project at the moment is called Illicit, which is also based on a language model that can do a lot of the grunt work of summarizing papers, of finding interesting literature relevant to your question, and can help you in the writing process a lot. So that's just a super useful tool that I've been using a lot, but also just on the thinking, they have a lot of smart thoughts about academia in general.
So they try to so they learn from what you found relevant before to predict what you will find relevant next?
So they are not fine-tuning their models at the moment. So everybody gets served the same model, as far as I know. So it shouldn't learn from like what you're doing at the moment. But this is, I guess, something that they are thinking about. No special insight.
I still haven't, I first heard about it at EA Global Reconnect, but I still haven't really looked closer into what they're writing exactly and what they're doing, but it sounds very important. Other projects I know about are, for example, Folded. I think that was an example about folding molecules or proteins, which is NP-hard. So it was just basically, they used the problem, which is just computation, very hard to solve, and created a game out of it, where then the players could just basically get points by trying to fold the proteins into a certain structure.
Yeah, this massive parallelized, decentralized science thing. I remember reading some criticism of that, and then in the end, the argument that perhaps it wasn't actually worth the scaling overhead, but I can't reproduce the argument, so forget that I said anything. I don't want to spread half-truths.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's intentionally, right? Like you have a lot of professionally written papers, and this is intentionally to give you a platform also to talk about more speculative ideas. And I guess on the EA forum, you would now write the epistemic status, which is in this case,
I remember having it in a dream.
Something like this, yes. So another thought that came to me right now was because you mentioned this doubt being a very central thing in academia. And that's something I often think about when I think of mental health problems in academia, because questioning yourself and questioning ideas seems to be so central to the scientific method, right? You always wonder, how is it wrong? And you always have to already anticipate what another smart person would criticize about what you're doing. And you basically internalize this way of thinking. And it seemed pretty straightforward that you have a very harsh internal monologue after doing this every day.
Yeah, that is a super interesting observation. I've never put it quite in those terms, but it makes a lot of sense. It's, I guess there is, I mean, this process of doubting just every individual step that you're describing is this Karl Popper classical way of falsificationism, where you try to just disprove every hypothesis that you come up with. And this is mirrored in this interaction with the reviewer, which can be super uncomfortable. I'm speaking from experience, and there definitely you get this cognitive dissonance where you try to model like what a adversarial opponent almost is going to say to whatever statement you're making. But research practice, I mean, there are other theories of how science is working, and one prominent opponent of Popper is Thomas Kuhn, who's saying more like there are scientific paradigms. So instead of at every individual step questioning all of your assumptions and trying to break them, you rather have a set of core theses, and then around that a set of auxiliary theses, and you kind of try to push those core theses forward and just see how far you can get by assuming them. And whenever you encounter evidence that goes against your construct of thesis, you start modifying your auxiliary thesis instead of modifying your core thesis. So that's, I think, a lot more congruent with how the human mind wants to work in many cases. Like Julia Galef has this great concepts of soldier mindset and scout mindset. So here we're soldiering forward and trying to push our message through. But of course, this Kuhnian framework can only work if there are multiple paradigms in parallel interacting with each other. Otherwise, there's just no correction mechanism anymore that tells us at what point we're running completely in a wrong direction. And also it has been criticized as p-hacking, right? P-hacking is this practice of just tweaking your parameters as long as until you finally get your significant result and you can start publishing, which is terrible for science at large and a big contributing factor to the reproduction crisis in psychology. So yeah, I'm still divided on what to think about this entire cluster of ideas. But
yeah, philosophy of science is surprisingly important. I've also thought a lot about it, especially because of Johannes Jäger, who introduced me to concepts like process philosophy and or like basic assumptions, like assuming the world is made out of things versus it's made out of processes, things like that. But also whether like the Wimsettian ideas, whether we're coming from axioms or we take kind of a robustness argument that just like when the same evidence points, like different evidence points at the same thing, we can also take it instead of just building it up from axioms. And then one idea I really liked was by Paul Thagard, who is a cognitive scientist, and he wrote about the cognitive science of science. So right, because we're all cognitive agents in the end, or like we're humans, and we're not Laplacian demons. How do you say it? We're not omniscient. That's what I'm saying. And we have our biases. And he talks about that often when you come into science, you have to really question your basic assumptions also in daily life. And often the learning is not just accumulating more data points, right? But it's conceptual changes. The whole framing shifts. And this also affects your own life often, because you just look at everything in a new way. And he even made the point that it would be really interesting or important maybe for students to have some kind of therapy during studying science, because let's say you come into the university with strong kind of non-naturalistic ideas, then it might be important to just like talk about that to like get some ideas of how to deal with it, because it's not distant from your personal life when you're honest about it.
I love that idea. That's really great. I mean, on the one hand, there is possibly still a remnant of stigma attached with mental health, even though things are like much better now than they used to be. So maybe this is now conceivable that you just get your therapist as soon as you start your PhD, which I guess like 10 years ago would have been kind of weird.
Or you could just also in the lecture just mention, right, okay, if you let go of those assumptions, it has ripple effects to the rest of your life, and these are some examples of how people deal with it, or right, so just like talking about it, making it explicit that this can happen. But in this case, I would just probably recommend the podcast where Paul Thagard talks about it. I think if you just search for cognitive science of science, and you'll find some of his ideas, which I really like.
Yeah.
Okay, we were talking about scaling academia. Do you feel like that topic is properly covered, or is there some resources you would want to mention about the topic, or some points you want to make?
Yes, I guess resources that I can mention is just the word meta science, which when you Google it leads you down a rabbit hole of lots of smart people that are thinking about this. Within EA, this is also something that's becoming more and more important. The New Science movement, newscience.org, from Alexei, is also one institution that's doing great stuff in that direction. So yeah, lots of exciting stuff coming from that direction.
Very nice. Thank you so much. Now I have a couple more general questions. So do you want to talk about how you initially got involved with effective altruism and how that was?
Sure. So I actually, back in 2012 or so, found the essay from Eliezer Yudkowsky on the AI box experiment, which is this fun thought experiment where he pretends to be an AI locked in a box and then convinces the test subjects to leave him out of the box by exploiting potentially cognitive biases, etc. And this got me interested in this whole cluster of ideas and eventually led to me studying cognitive science in the bachelor. And then I've always been exposed to effective altruism, but more in the background, and didn't really get super involved with it until the COVID pandemic happened. And there it just happened to be the case that the local meetup group in Darmstadt switched to fully online meetups. And that was one of the few things that were still happening in the pandemic at all. So I just thought, okay, why don't I show up there sometimes? And yeah.
And it clicked.
It clicked, yeah.
Very nice. So the course areas you mentioned now were AI safety and probably scaling science probably falls under institutional decision making or something like that. Are there any other of the main ideas you're very excited about or interested in?
Yeah. So I think in terms of neglectedness, still animal advocacy is less represented in the world than it should be relative to its importance. I recently had a blog post where I criticized some research on whether animals are conscious or not, which does not mean at all that I don't believe that animals have worth and should be living and can experience pain and so on. I can totally think all of that is the case. I'm just not even sure if humans are conscious. Completely different barrel of worms to open. But what I'm saying is I do strongly believe that, saving animals from humans is a really important thing. I just don't see my skill set fitting into that context as well. So I only support them through donations. And then, global health, global poverty are the classic EA things, which now, at least within the EA community, feel a little bit like we've reached the point where each additional EA can probably not make as much impact as an additional EA in the other areas. AI policy is often lumped together with AI safety, but I think it's potentially even more important because it's fewer people who are interested in that topic in particular. It's a weird combination of skills that you need for that, where you need to be both policy minded and have a fun basic understanding of how AI works. That's a rare skill set.
Yes. So very broad interest there. Any view on where effective altruism currently gets it wrong the most?
I am a little bit skeptical about hero worship a little bit. So certainly the big philosophers that contribute thoughts along the EA thinking are very smart people and very well read, but it is beyond taking their arguments at face value. sometimes there's a bit of glorification going on that I think might just be dangerous for the movement in general. I think we should remain decentralized and independent thinkers, like connected by a set of values, but not by hero worship.
Yeah, that's a very good argument too. Right? Like take the ideas, look at the ideas, and not give them any additional value because they're coming from a certain person that seems to have been doing reasonable thing in the past. Yeah, that seems very
just like I did at the beginning of the conversation with Toby Ord, where I brought him forward as one of the big examples why somebody should be believing in AI safety. There, I actually did exactly the thing that I just now said.
Yeah, but
it's natural, right?
I mean, you know, but you also have to do both, right? So at some point you cannot just like summarize the whole argumentation. So you have to point at someone else who has done that already. And then people have to go and read that. Mm-hmm. That's also connected to another point I make a lot, which is you talked about right, like productivity hacks. And I was really into all the life hack ideas, and I was really into quantified self. And I think my kind of meta position there is by now, you just cannot hack the important things, which means you have to read the actual books, which means you actually have to work to get something done. And you will not, by thinking, find this magic leverage point where you can suddenly fix it all. Like, no, you will actually have to learn stuff and do stuff. And so like in general, the question of how can I hack this is just very dangerous. So that's to pedal back. That's why I think it's totally valid to refer to another book or another person and their work, while of course not saying everything what they're saying is necessarily true. So
yeah, interesting point. I agree.
Yeah. Okay, so meta points about EA. What have you changed your mind about recently?
So I was very excited about the scaling hypothesis, which is this idea you just throw more parameters, more computational power at an AI algorithm, and then this is basically guaranteeing you unbounded growth. And I don't even know where I picked up that idea that this is what the thesis is, but I mean, the actual research or the actual way that things work is much more nuanced. And in particular, if you throw a lot of data from the internet at a language model, the best thing you can probably get out is human performance, because there are only humans on the internet. And then it might be a very fast human, and it might be a super knowledgeable human across like lots and lots of domains, but it's still not completely obvious that this would start bootstrapping itself or go like unboundedly in cognitive capacity. So yeah, that I felt kind of silly when somebody told me that this is also a part of the scaling argument.
Yeah. Okay, so you first thought it was plausible, and then you noticed, okay, this doesn't actually make sense.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think one of the important ideas to understand here is the no free lunch theorem, right? And I think Julian Schrittwieser from the AlphaGo algorithm, he wrote, it's not only that there is no free lunch, it even gets more expensive every day, right? Like right, every additional power in the algorithms get like actually computationally more and more expensive. So I really like his blog post about that. That makes a lot of sense. Okay, any cool book you've recently read and you would want to recommend?
Let's see. Reading lots and lots of blog posts at the moment.
Also valid.
Applied Divinity Study is of course great. I love the stuff from Suspended Reason. I'm sure there was a book that I read recently. Oh yeah, I started research Hesse. I'm revisiting Hermann Hesse, who I used to like when I was a teenager, like every other teenager probably.
Yes, I loved Hesse too. Yeah. Is it something about Germans or?
I don't know. I think there's a stereotype associated with that. Yeah.
Which book have you been reading?
Siddhartha.
Oh yeah, that's also my favorite one. Oh, really? And did it like do as much as when you were younger?
I read it. It's funny to it feels like it's a completely different book, but of course I'm just a completely different person. It's different. It's no longer. it doesn't sway me as much emotionally, or it doesn't pull as strongly, but I see the worldview more clearly. I can see like the author and like what kind of assumptions and what kind of state of mind the author was in when writing this thing.
Nice. There I can also throw in a book that's maybe kind of related. There's a book called How the World Thinks by a philosopher who made the point, when we study philosophy, then we basically just study Western philosophy, and usually either continental or analytical one. But of course, there's many more philosophies. And he wrote this book to just show what are the assumptions about epistemology, about the self, about morality in different philosophies, really like global philosophies. And I found it both surprising, but often I could really have a glimpse of how the world would look through the different lens. And I feel like because Siddhartha is also like very influenced or built on Buddhist philosophy, it has a very similar effect, but on a slightly more academic level, because he really, just also teaches you a lot.
I agree. Yeah, I'm a bit skeptical. I mean, I've read that even people who grew up with Buddhism think that Siddhartha is an interesting experiment, or like captures something important and central about this. But it's always weird when an old white dude, I don't know, writes about a different culture from the perspective of knowing everything about that culture and like actually capturing the Buddha.
Yeah, sure. No, that's very preposterous to some degree. I think in the How the World Thinks, it was written with a lot of humility, and like really like this is basically an introduction to how you could potentially make the first step towards having an understanding at some point. So I felt like that was really well put in perspective. So for my side, we would like roughly come to an end now. So thank you so much for coming on. And is there anything you still want to add, a shout out or something I missed to say?
No, I want to thank you very much for having me. It was a very nice conversation. And I hope there will be many more, recorded or not. Really great talking to you.